On September 6th and 7th, 1989, over 200 General Motors executives and managers attended the GM Conference on Global Warming, sponsored by the Environmental Activity Staff. Understanding the issues of global warming are fundamentally important to future business and product planning. The first day focused on presentations by leaders from scientific and public policy communities. They discussed the science of global warming, national and international policy options, and implications for the automobile industry worldwide. The second day featured speakers from General Motors discussing public policy responses and the implications for product plans, as well as research and development. Vice President of GM's Environmental Activity Staff, Dr. Betsy Anker Johnson, opened the conference.
Global warming isn't exactly a new issue. Scientists have been concerned about this issue for some time. But recently, because of the unusually warm summers that we had a couple summers ago, it has moved into the mainstream of public concern. So that now it's an integral part of the growing public concern about a whole spectrum of environmental issues. Today's program is divided into three areas. The first is an examination of the science of global warming, what we know and what we don't know. The second is an examination of the possible national and international policy responses. International because if there is a global warming problem, it is certainly and truly an international one. Finally, we will address the implications of the situation for the international auto industry. Any strategy to combat global warming will have a significant impact on our products, our plants, our processes. The more stringent CAFE proposals that are being defended by global warming considerations could require drastic changes to powertrains and vehicle mass. Control of another greenhouse gas, chlorofluorocarbons, will require total revision of our air conditioning systems. A switch to a totally different fuel than gasoline is also being suggested as a potential solution. These contingencies need to be understood and considered for our future product planning. Our purpose in holding this conference is to inform GM leadership, especially the operating people among us, about the science and policy implications of global warming.
It ought to be said at the start that there isn't any doubt at all that the greenhouse effect is real. As has been mentioned, it's the reason why the planet is as warm and habitable as it is. Were there no atmosphere and ocean to trap heat, we'd have a climate like that of the moon, 60 degrees Fahrenheit colder than the Earth and with severe day-night differences. We're talking about the consequences of changing this greenhouse effect a little bit relative to that 60 degrees, rather than whether or not the greenhouse effect itself is real. The yellow arrows on the left represent sunlight, which largely passes through the atmosphere unimpeded, and the orange arrows on the right represent the heat energy, the infrared radiation from the Earth, which, as you heard from Dr. Ramanathan, is partly trapped by gases in the atmosphere, and we're changing the relative abundance of some of those gases. That's also unambiguous. All three of us have shown you this wiggly curve of carbon dioxide. The wiggles, incidentally, are the seasonal variations, the biosphere breathing, trees taking in carbon dioxide during the growing season and giving it off in the senescence season. And during the 30 years or so that carbon dioxide has been measured by my colleague Charles David Keeling at Scripps, it has gone up about 10%. We know what it was in pre-industrial times, roughly a century ago, was about 25% increase since those times. So there's no doubt at all about the increase in carbon dioxide or the fact that the major source of the increase today is fossil fuel burning and other human activities. Here's the kind of picture that the models are producing. This isn't actually the result from any one model. It's a kind of composite. But nonetheless, it's a broad brush, coarse-grained kind of picture. The darker reds represent the more serious warmings, and you can see that the strongest warming occurs at high northern latitudes. That's due to several effects, of which the most important is the ice albedo feedback that Dr. Ramanathan mentioned. The fact that melting snow cover and sea ice exposes a darker, more absorbing surface and enhances the warming. You can see that in the tropics, and especially in the southern hemisphere, the warming is less pronounced. The congressman wants to know, what will the warming be in my district the year I stand for re-election? And the honest answer from models is, we don't know. And when the models are intercompared, they tend to agree on these broad-brush global planetary scale features, but they tend to disagree as to the regional and transient aspects of what will happen in the short term in a given portion of the world. I think that if there's one single one of the pictures that I'm showing that I'd like you to keep in your minds, it's this one here, which shows, and again in a sketch cartoon kind of way, a varying temperature record. We're using temperature here as a surrogate for all the things we'd like to know about the climate over a period of time from the middle of this century on up until the early part of the next century. And the orange band there with the red fluctuations is put there to symbolize the fact that climate always varies. It varies on every time scale of which we have any record, from the year-to-year variations to the Ice Age periods. It's likely that in the climate of the future there will still be year-to-year variations. There will be wet summers and dry summers in given parts of the world. There'll be anomalously harsh and anomalously mild winters. But one can expect to see, if what we've been telling you pans out, that as time goes on, perhaps within a couple of decades, or 3 is my estimate, one will gradually see a long-term climate change emerging from the noisy record of the year-to-year.
What is the policy environment that we're heading into with respect to climate warming? I usually use the phrase that the climate warming is sort of a happening, both domestically and internationally. No question it's high now on the agendas of people politically, both here and abroad. And it's an issue that lends itself to easy support by leaders everywhere. After all, we're talking about saving the habitability of the planet. That's what we're about. And it seems to rank in importance with, and has sort of the political panache of preventing nuclear war, destruction of the planet from nuclear war. It's come to that level. Why do I say that? I say it because if you look at what is going on in the policy arena, it has all the earmarks of a policy train that has left the station. Whether the science that we heard this morning is correct or incorrect, it is quite clear that there is out there a perception that something is going to happen, and we're going to have to deal both with the realities and the perceptions. Let's take a look at some of the characteristics of this policy issue that faces us. First, the causes and the effects are distributed globally. That is, action in a single country will not help, except perhaps if we want to demonstrate leadership in the United States or some other nation wishes to demonstrate leadership. It has to be international action. The causes of our predicament stem from the most fundamental of human activities: the use of fossil energy, our agricultural practices, economic development, population increases. But what are the categories of the policy options that we might look at? We heard one this morning. One is certainly research. I'll talk about that. One is in mitigation, actually trying to arrest the pace of the climate warming. And lastly, it would be in areas of adaptation, as we would need to think about how we might adapt to a climate change. Those are the general policy areas that I'd like to talk about. First, let me talk about policy in the research area. It seems to me, from what we have heard this morning, that the sine qua non of any policy for this country and for the world must be to focus on the reduction of the scientific uncertainties involved. And we learned that there are many of them. We know that we're weak in dealing with mathematical modeling of the feedback processes in the atmosphere. We heard about cloud feedback this morning, ocean atmosphere feedback. We need to get our mathematical models to begin to give us information on a regional and local basis, and they can't do that very well today. And that means more computer power, a better understanding of the physical processes. The second area of research, and one that troubles me greatly, has to be research on economic and social consequences and the costs of the various options. In order for us to develop policies in an informed way, we need to understand how much it's going to cost us and who's going to do the paying. Let me talk then about mitigation and what policies we might look at with respect to mitigation. Here, what we want to do is to arrest the rate of climate warming. And since we know the causes of the climate warming, these are the emissions of CO2, CFCs, N2O, methane into the atmosphere, we know some of the things that would be important to do. Let's take a look at some of them. Well, it seems to me that the first line of defense has to be energy efficiency and conservation. I don't know of anybody who has looked at this problem who has come up with a different answer. That is the universal, traditional wisdom answer to the problem. It happens to be right. If we're going to reduce carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere, we have to reduce the use of fossil fuels. That means we have to look at energy efficiency, technology, and conservation. And of course, we want to curtail other greenhouse gases. CFCs, we know, as a result of the Montreal Protocol, are being restricted, and there are proposals for totally phasing out CFCs, and assuming we can get substitutes, and this, of course, will directly affect the automotive industry because of the air conditioning systems in automobiles. Assuming we can get that, that seems to be a logical direction in which to head. And I don't think, from what we heard this morning, and my own personal views, that we are in a panic situation. But we certainly are in a situation where we ought to be very prudent about what we're doing. First, I think it's absolutely vital that we link whatever policy actions we take to the base of our scientific knowledge. And my concern right now, as I cited in my opening remarks about all of the policy actions that are now being taken, is that policies are beginning to outrun our scientific base. Secondly, I think that we ought to think about adopting and moving in the direction of those policy actions, okay, that have the greatest benefit, either from an economic point of view or multiple leverage on environmental problems, and would be the least costly to implement. I would undertake more costly measures later until I really had a firmer grasp on the science and I had a firmer grasp on the costs of the various policy options.
The global warming issue, very similar to some of the clean air, acid rain related issues that are now under discussion in Congress, will set energy policy for this country for the remainder, certainly, of this century and well into the next century. My own sense is, much as we find ourselves, basically it is a given that we will have acid rain legislation. That given has come, interestingly enough, about a year before what was supposed to be the principal scientific reporting on the acid rain issue, that we're going to go through the same phenomenon with global warming, that the political givens will be set in place before the research is finished. But I do not think that any of you should be led to believe that the debate on this issue will follow rational paths, that people will wait for that research to come in, or that they will even necessarily wait for international action. In fact, I think, and this is an area where I think there is some analogy with CFCs, that the issue is so complex, the policymakers will be so perplexed in coming up with answers, that the temptation to resort to sort of a generic, we'll do a % reduction and then look around and see where we are after that % reduction, will be intense.
What I'd like to do is to share with you 3 propositions which I hope make us think about the organizational challenge, the political challenge, and the profit-making opportunity that global warming represents. My first proposition is a simple one. The competitive challenge from global warming, in my judgment, is not primarily a challenge of science. It is not primarily a challenge of politics or a challenge of economics. It is primarily a challenge to our manufacturing and organizational skills. Whatever the global warming challenge means for the environment, I know that global warming means several very specific things for the auto industry. I don't know whether the rainforests add to or detract from the greenhouse effect, but I do know that global warming means higher production costs for automobiles. I don't know whether the level of the oceans are going to rise or fall with global warming, but I do know that global warming means changes in the number of automobiles that we sell and changes in the mix of automobiles we sell. Since any response to global warming means greater energy efficiency, that means automobiles smaller than average today. I don't know whether global warming is a secular trend or not, but I do know the policy challenge of global warming is going to make some of our physical capital become obsolete. And more importantly, it's going to make some of our human and organizational capacity become obsolete as well. The technical skills it takes to use alternative energy sources, to sell smaller cars, or to manage an international environmental problem are simply different from many of the skills that GM possesses today. I don't know whether the policy response to the global warming problem is going to be a carbon fee or higher CAFE standards or some kind of permit system, but I do know that one of the consequences of global warming will be that profits in this industry will shift in the value-added chain, among dealers, between suppliers, among manufacturers and energy producers. In other words, what I know about the global warming problem climatologically is Zippo, but what I know competitively is that these are all problems for line managers in this business. Let's face it, we all know that the environmental challenge of global warming is long-term and uncertain. We heard about that this morning. But I absolutely guarantee that the political challenge of global warming will be short-term and probably crisis-oriented. There is no telling what will create that crisis. And there is no telling what the circumstances will be that prevail when the crisis occurs. There could be 3 hot summers in a row when there are 50 hostages in Iran and there are lines at the gas pumps. Or it could be gasoline is 50 cents a gallon. We're buddy-buddy with the new Ayatollah, and it's been cold for years. Who knows what it's going to be? We don't know, but it will come suddenly, and no amount of staff work, no amount of political lobbying can protect GM's manufacturing and production systems from this vulnerability. That protection must come from the production system itself. My second proposition is a political proposition, and that is, and this will be news to people in this room, but not everyone is going to believe what GM has to say about the global warming problem. To gain real political control of this situation, in my judgment, GM may have to give up some of the trappings of apparent control of their own destiny. The auto industry is an easy target, politically and bureaucratically. I strongly believe that GM needs strategic alliances with outside parties if it's going to address the question of global warming effectively. To reduce its own vulnerability and increase its credibility, GM will need to sacrifice direct control of its fate and substitute indirect control via mutual vulnerability. My third proposition that I want to discuss with you is an economic proposition, and that is that all environmental challenges create winners as well as losers in the competitive marketplace. In fact, I personally believe that it is GM's ethical and economic obligation to meet the challenge of global warming profitably. It is our ethical obligation because society has created this corporation to advance its purposes, and global warming is one of them. It is our economic obligation because to do otherwise is to fail in our commitment to produce transportation services this world requires.
So what should our strategy be? Obviously, fuel economy or fuel conservation has to be part of the solution, as Betsy noted. If we're going to put less CO2 into the atmosphere, we're going to have to burn less gasoline in our engines and still produce an equivalent or greater amount of horsepower. In our processes and plants, we're going to have to conserve energy. If we use less, we'll emit less CO2. And in the long run, that's in line with other trends. But we're talking about a long-term strategy today, and any way you cut it, global warming and other environmental concerns are not quick-fix problems. We don't even have a clear-cut goal in mind yet. We're still feeling our way on that, and that's what's behind this conference, to get a cross-section of thinking on it. Now, on a more complex level, we've already announced steps to eliminate CFCs, chemicals that contribute to global warming, as well as depletion of the ozone layer, both in our operations and our products. Now, by taking a leadership position on this issue and other environmental issues, I anticipate we can be ahead of the industry on this. In some cases, it's going to be tough to motivate our people. The sky is not falling. The global temperature is not going to rise several degrees in the next year or even in the next decade. And there's no obvious change in the climate that makes people recognize the need for action. On the other hand, the best experts tell us that global warming is possible and even probable. Therefore, it's an issue we must face. We have to recognize it, and we have to take prudent steps now as opposed to wild leaps 10 years from now. There's also a real opportunity, and we should turn this challenge to our advantage. We've got more resources and more capabilities than the competition, so we should be out front if there's a way to reduce CO2 emissions. Our experience in designing clean, fuel-efficient engines should help us move to the next step. We're the fuel economy leaders with many of our vehicles, and we should be able to build on that leadership. So let's look at this as a chance to continue a way to outdistance the competition, to do the job better, to improve our reputation, and to potentially increase sales. At General Motors, we're determined to do our part. And at the same time, we intend to keep running our business in a profitable and efficient way in harmony with our environment. Yesterday and today, we began to lay some of the groundwork for the future of General Motors in the critical environmental areas. And knowing this group, I'm confident it's going to be a good future and that General Motors will be successful.